here, if it's okay. It says, in Maimonides' view, saying that God has a body is not just incorrect, but blasphemous and adulterous. He sees God as unique and transcendent, irreducible to anything human or material. And, get this, and if God does not literally speak, then the Bible cannot be the literal word of God.
Yes, that's the Rambam. I was always tempted, just as I mentioned before, that I wrote this paper for Mordecai Kaplan's class that I took way back in the 60s, whether one could pray to Kaplan's God. And I now think that I should have written the paper, Can One Pray to Rambam's God? All right. His son, who came after him, and was the chief rabbi, the Sufi gathering was right next door or just on the same block as the synagogue. And at some point, we have actually this description from some source that he was really fed up with the lack of kavana of his congregation. So he told them all to go to the Sufi gathering and learn how to pray and learn how to reach higher realms. So that's why the Sufi order that was established, the Jewish Sufi order, we call them Jufis, right? That the sheikh of that order was Reb Zalman. All right. And in fact, when Nadia and I got to Boulder in 2000, the first thing Zalman had us go to with him was the Sufi gathering. There's a wonderful group of Sufis here in Boulder. And one of the best experiences I ever had for Simchat Torah was when we held it with the Jewish Renewal Community, and Sufis came. So you can just imagine what the dancing was like with the Torah. And the son of the person who was Zalman's good friend is a whirling dervish. So it got kind of wild and wonderful.
Universal Sufi order.
You're
Hazrat Nayat Khan and Sufi Sam.
Right. They're the what do you want to call it? The lineage of the relationship of Sufis and Sufism to Jewish renewal, primarily Reb Zalman, but others in San Francisco and Berkeley in the early days of the emergence of the Aquarian Minyan, etc. And here in Boulder, once Reb Zalman got here, the linkage with the Sufi. So Sufism is the Islamic version of Kabbalah. It's the mystical expression. So now that everybody is here, or almost everybody is here, just want to kind of backtrack and start with the opening that I think is most appropriate for this study and investigation. Behold, we are about to perform the positive mitzvah, that we shall love our neighbors, the other, as much as we love ourselves. So the first step in that process, spiritual process, is check in and make sure that you do love yourself. All right. and increase that amount without egoism, and then say, hey, I got enough energy with love to love the other. And you do that. And that extends to one of the things that I learned first in Berkeley from the Alter Shoresh Barry Barkin, the first Bal HaBracha, and then from Reb Zalman, who kind of gave me graduate studies in offering blessings, is while you're standing there in the line at the grocery store, to when you finally go up to the checkout, while the person is counting up what you bought, offer him or her a blessing. All right. He or she has been standing on his or her feet for a very long time, for very low pay, and deserves a blessing. All right. So I'm going to make you do some work, but I want to preface the work with a setting for you to do the work here. And I just want to bring to your attention, I put two items for bibliography, and they're both dealing with Islam. The best book on Islam for us to read is first Reza Aslan's book, No God But God, The Origins and Evolution of Islam. And you will thoroughly enjoy reading it because he's a professor of creative writing at UC, University of California, Riverside. And so he knows how to write. And this is an amazing book. I believe it's $4.99, inexpensive on Kindle. And there is kind of a study guide that was written by him for high school students, if I remember correctly. It's also available on Amazon for the same price, but it's about 1/4 the length of the other book. But if you have to have a book on Islam, that's it. There is another book, Islam for Jews, I think is the title, written by Ruvain Firestone, who is a professor at the University of Southern California and at Union Hebrew College, Hebrew Union College, excuse me, in Los Angeles. It's a little dry. That's why I prefer Aslan's book. Aslan also wrote a very controversial book, only controversial because when it came out, Fox interviewed him and said to him, how dare you, as a Muslim, write a book about Jesus? The book is called Zealot, and it's an excellent book on Christianity. Little did the stupidity that reigned supreme on Fox, that was a political announcement, realized that Aslan had been a Christian and then kind of reconverted back to Islam, and he knows his religions. All right. So, there are a number of YouTubes of him. So if you want to get a quick introduction to Islam, listen to him on YouTube. He's really very good. Now, according to a very recent poll that was taken in the southern states, which if you had to say that there's a sector or a geographic area in the United States, separated from other geographic areas, say the Northeast or the West or what have you. We'll call it the South. The South is considered to be the most religiously identified, allegiance-wise, et cetera, of this country. Okay? So in a recent survey in the South, 50% of adults interviewed say they never go to church, synagogue, or to a mosque. 50%. Okay? Now, according to a 2008 Pew survey, 1 in 5 Christians in America believe that non-Christian faiths cannot lead one to salvation. 1 in 5, so that's 20%. That number soared to 60% of white evangelical Protestants who attend church once a week. A survey of over 35,000 Americans in 2008 found that most Americans agree with the statement, quote, many religions, not just their own, can lead to eternal life. Among those affiliated with some religious tradition, 7 in 10 say many religions can lead to eternal life. This view is shared by a majority of adherents to nearly all religious traditions, including 82% of Jews, 79% of Catholics, 57% of evangelical Protestants, and 56% of Muslims. Okay? Thus, in the 21st century, most Christians, Jews, and Muslims have rejected the only one truth religious mindset and believe in the Quran's pluralism teachings, which goes as follows from the Quran. For every one of you did we appoint a law and a way. If Allah had wanted, he could have made you one people nation, but he didn't, that he might test you in what he gave you. Therefore, complete with one another to hasten to do virtuous deeds, for all will return to Allah for judgment. So he will let you know about that in which you differed. Okay? So if you notice in the Quran, there's kind of a hesitation to give a blanket statement, and that's reflected in that of the percentage that that believed in that all religious traditions you can get to the kingdom, so to speak, that the lowest number was Muslims, 56%, and the highest was among Jews and Catholics, and then it dropped down by 30% of evangelical Protestants. So in other words, out there are fewer and fewer people who are engaged in church attendance, synagogue attendance, and mosque attendance. Despite the fact that Europeans view the United States as a wacko, ultra-religious country, the reality is that it isn't, right? That the statistics from 2008 to the present indicate a serious decline in attendance. Now, what does that really mean? We don't know. Most of the people who write about these polls and interpret the polls say they're not really sure what the indication is, except that as we gravitate towards the emergence and heaviest population cohorts being not the generation that all of us exist in, the boomer generation, is that there is growing less and less attentiveness to churches, synagogues, and mosques. That's the first indication. So the question is, what does deep ecumenism have to do with the non-religious or the non-identified? Just to give you another statistic, that when the Denver Jewish Federation Council, which also includes the Boulder Jewish community, basically covers all of Colorado, hired a polling organization to find out the nature of the Jewish community, what was discovered about Boulder County that at that time of the polling effort comprised about 17,000 Jewish households. 70% of those households did not identify in any way, shape, or form with the Jewish community. So, of the synagogues that are here in Boulder, they constitute a small minority of Jewish households. And even when you look at the most minimal identification in the Jewish community of Boulder County, i.e., the Jewish Community Center here in Boulder, it is still 70% don't identify in any way. So what you've got is two groupings. One are, I'll call them hardcore identifiers with churches, synagogues, and mosques. The other grouping are those that are not involved in that by identification purposes. That doesn't mean that they're not influenced or affected by the religious dialogue that might be going on. And it doesn't eliminate the fact that what shows up in newspapers and magazines and everything has a certain religious flavor in the United States. So I'm presenting this at the beginning so that you can prepare yourself to do some work. Now I'll give you what is the work. First, the material. Okay. Let me get to the right. This is from Reb Zalman on page 28 of the document that I gave you on deep ecumenism. The people who are awake, when Zalman says that, he's talking about people who take religion seriously, okay? The people who are awake and aware in other religions also know the crisis in which they are now. Years ago, in conversations with Harvey Cox, who's professor of religion at Harvard University, it was very clear. With Thomas Merton, it was very clear. We each knew that we are in trouble, and if we don't do something to widen our theological reality maps. Modernizing came about because Christians were concerned about the God field. The God field is not holding enough energy for connecting with the miraculous order. And none of us know how to change it efficiently anymore. one more bit. When we deal with the issue of Christianity, I'd like to help you understand some things, says Zalman. We Jews have a strong allergic reaction to anything having to do with Christianity, anything having to do with Jesus. We have to get past this. We have to begin with compassion for all life, with a post-triumphalist understanding, tools for wiggling the mind, strategies for dealing with the representatives of other religions, engaging sympathetically with those other religions. Why do we want to do that? The answer is that every religious group has lost vital body mass at this point. It's easy to show it with Catholics. In early days, you may have the memory of driving by a Catholic church and seeing that a novena, special prayers that are recited over a specific amount of time, was being held in the church. There would be vespers, adoration, all kinds of other services besides Mass. What they're left with is only the Big Bertha. They only have the Mass today. Everything else has shrunken away. Judaism has the same problem. Most of our communities don't have a minyan every day, never mind 3 services each day. We meet on Friday evening for Shabbos, and maybe some places on Shabbos morning, but hardly any of us are doing Shalasudas, the third meal of Sabbath afternoon. We're going through the motions. Our Siddur has become a freeze-dried brownie. We know there's something tasty in there, but all the juice has been squeezed out. It's necessary to enrich again what we have. But now maybe sometimes we can't enrich it from within. Sometimes the best way to enrich it may be to import something. Okay, full stop. Okay? Reb Zalman elsewhere talks about the God field. In Hebrew, it is called Binyan HaMalchut, building the kingdom. Okay? Now, whether the kingdom is in heaven or the kingdom is on earth, therein there is differentiation between Christianity and Judaism, but that's irrelevant at this point. Binyan HaMalchut is something that we should take very seriously, particularly at this time of year. As we approach the month of Elul, which will be happening very soon, according to the Kabbalah, God descends and takes up temporary residence in the God field. And as people go by to experience, to hear, to see God's presence, the request of the people is that for another year, Rosh Hashanah being the beginning of that new coming year, that God will also go back on his throne and assume the role of God. There's a sense in the Kabbalistic material that God could say, you know, you disappointed me. I'm not interested anymore, whatever. So they beseech God to once again become the Kodesh Baruch Hu. All right? Now, that God field, that Binyan HaMalchut, according to Zalman, is weak. The batteries are very, very weak. They need to be recharged. Part of it was the reason why we can associate the weakness is those statistics that I read. All right. Religion is losing its import, its force. All right. It is no longer a force field that compels people. And there is far more negativity flowing from religion to kind of blot out some of the good sounds that emanate. You talk to people who are no longer identified with church, synagogue, mosque, and ask them why. Right? And they'll tell you. And those things need to be dealt with. But Zalman goes on and says, no religious tradition today, because of much of what I cited at the beginning. In addition, there's much more of lack of creativity, lack of teaching, of speaking to the issues that people are most concerned about, communities are most concerned about, that no religion on its individual basis is capable of recharging the God field. No longer are they capable, have the energy, the desire, the wish maybe, to build the kingdom. And so Zalman argues in this text that you all have that it takes a group effort, the group's effort, the combining with other spiritual traditions to do that work. And the only way to do it is through deep ecumenical contact, engagement, and decision to work together for the purpose of re-energizing the God field for good. I'll stop there. I'll take Mark's question, and then I want to go into the activity that I want you to engage in. Go ahead, Mark.
I have more of a comment on what you just said, which is I hope we'll be seeing experience as kind of a complementary ideas to what you just presented. The crisis is real. I think you, Rabbi Victor, I think you did a great job of just describing it. The statistics that you quoted at the beginning are also quoted at the beginning of the book that I mentioned last week, To Be a Jew Today by Noah Feldman. And Noah Feldman goes in a different direction with that. And he's in agreement that 50 to 55% of Americans, some people in Western Europe, also who were Jews who were also interviewed, that 50 to 55% absolutely have no engagement with any form of active religious practice, Jewish or otherwise. Of course, Feldman's book is focused on Jews. He says some of them have a sense of what he calls Jewishness. And that really is the area that gets explored in this book, To Be a Jew Today by Noah Feldman. He says of the remaining 45% of Jews who identify and have some level of engagement in terms of practice, which my guess would be almost everybody on this call and many people that we know, that of that remaining 45%, they are divided into three characteristic groups, which are not Orthodox, conservative, Reform, Reconstruction, or any of the identified movements. And in those three different groups is where the fundamental variation happens between those who want to remain connected to the practice of the carrying out of Jewish law and practice, not because they like the ethical values in it, not because of more simplistic reasons, but because they truly believe that this is the word of God and what God has required. And so they organize their institutions in order to create the opportunities to fulfill that law. So there's a focus towards the past. The second group Feldman talks about is a group that I think I personally identify with. He calls them the progressives. And what the progressives have done is they've culled through the last 2,000 years of Jewish learning and Jewish practice, and they've come to a conclusion that they are yearning for a religion that expresses moral values that matches the liberal worldview that they have. So in simple terms, these are the people who say Judaism is about justice. It may be about shatnez. It may be about all the Talmudic discussions about how many walls need to exist in order to be there as sukkah. Yes, it includes all of that. But when Judaism and Jewishness moves forward, these progressives are interested in tikkun olam, and they're interested in tzedek tirdof. And that's the fundamental motivation. And the progressives constitute about 30% of the 45 or 50% of Jews who have some actual practice. And the third group is the group that Feldman calls the evolutionists. These are the people who are trying to find a way to honor the past, not only in practice, but in theology and in philosophy and in community. They do come from a place of where Judaism and Jews have been, but they recognize that those conditions do not exist anymore. And I think there's some overlap with what Reb Zalman was therefore saying to us. So I really think that recognizing that the situation today in this century and the one that's confronted by the different generations, ourselves, as Rabbi Victor said very clearly, mostly a boomer community, we have a very different experience than some of the younger generations, unless they are inside the traditionalist group. Because then the foundation, the basic goal of that group is to make sure that the young kids are raised in such a way that they will continue the traditions that their quote unquote Orthodox or modern Orthodox families or people have.
I have something to say.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so, and I'll wrap it up. And so what I'm
Please.
suggesting is that in addition to Reb Zalman's accurate description of the loss of religiosity across the board in most different faiths, there's also a dynamic going on that has split the American Jewish community in particular. And this is the struggle that we're dealing with. I'm involved in a discussion group that's going through that book right now. That's why it's kind of coming off my tongue like this. I would be glad to share an overview that was written about Feldman's book if you all would like it. And you can have that.
So
take a look
Mark,
at it.
Mark, send it to me and I'll send it up to everybody.
All right, I'll be glad to do that.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. I
Well-
want to take Diane and then Sippy based
Okay.
on when hands came up, but I'll remember.
I
Go
don't
ahead.
know if I was first or not, and So if you,
I
if you-
thought I saw it.
okay, this is just short. I have come to a new way of thinking about the religion as for Judaism, as far as having direct meaning to me, and I'm finding it more in the unaffiliated Jewish communities, in the so-called independent or like renewal, where people are showing up not just to daven the words on the page, because many don't connect with that at first, but in terms of seeking community, seeking connection with other people, against the isolationism that many feel. And I'm listening to Rabbi Sharon Browse's book, The Amen Effect, and the message of showing up and listening to people is very strong in that. And I think that the religion of today is more of a sociological thing that's going to bring people to connection, rather than, they said, going to a particular, seeking out a reform, conservative, or orthodox, unless that's your way of life and you firmly believe in it. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Boy, you've come a long way in all the years I've known you. All right. Which is all positive. I mean, in the sense of understanding besides just doing, which is the hardest thing for anybody in any religion to do, to avoid certain pitfalls. So thank you, Diane. It's been great watching you travel. Go ahead, Sippy.
Let me see. I am responding to the translation of the word malchut as kingdom. And I see a rise in the feminine. I know you do also. And every time I hear kingdom, I feel excluded. And I'm wondering if that is part of the exit that happens in religion, is the rise of the feminine and being seen, which I think is really important. I think when you talk about justice, I think the DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and the equity piece, to me, is crucial, especially in deep ecumenism, because equity means looking at everybody else that's there and honoring them. I worked as that's period. I worked as the videographer in an Episcopal church in Beaufort, South Carolina, and every service was full. And I'm wondering where everybody is going to, because I see this at every service that I videotape for them, that it was packed. It was a packed house, especially when they had a picnic. But that's half of the course. So I understand people are leaving, and there are people that are staying.
Mhm. Yeah. Thank you. And I want to go back to your first point, Cynthia, about I use the translation of Malchut as Reb Zalman used it. I also became very conscious when I arrived at the Jewish Theological Seminary and Rabbinical School in 1968. New York was buzzing with feminism. It was really the beginning of it. Gloria Steinem reigned supreme. And then emerged, even though she was Jewish, Jewish feminism. There was a consciousness raising that was going on.
Mhm.
I was attending JTS, which was an all-male school, and Judith Hauptman, one of the leading Talmudists of our time, wrote a public request to study with the great Talmudist Saul Lieberman. She didn't want to become a rabbi at that time. All she wanted to do was study Talmud with the greatest. So we got placards, particularly the ones who came from California, the rabbinical students, pleading with Saul Lieberman, who was the rector of the seminary, to let her in as a student. He, of course, refused. My wife, Nadia, in 1970, wrote a letter to JTS applying to rabbinical school. She never got a response. So in certain sense, we have traveled a certain distance. We're still not there. In other words, whatever is a good term, unfortunately, both in Christianity and in Judaism, we use the term the kingdom of heaven, or Malchut Shemayim in Hebrew, and the kingdom here on earth, which is the Binyan HaMalchut, building the kingdom. Look, at the same time, my teacher before Zalman was Heschel. And Heschel's books all reflect the old paradigm languaging. God in search of man is the best example. And his dear daughter wrote an article saying, you know, knowing my father, if he was alive now, he would change the title of so many of his books. All right, it's a linguistic prison that we lived in at that time. All right, so I appreciate always the correction when I have tried when I have taught courses on Heschel to change every time I refer to something in his writings and he says man, I try it, but Heschel wrote poetry in prose, and it loses its thing, whatever that is, when you change the language. All right, but you know, I have a son who I need to refer to as they. All right, and early on, I've tried to argue with them that grammatically it drives me up a wall, because I was taught grammar, unlike today's students. All right, I was taught the diagram, and I don't know how to diagram they and all those things. And I just laughed at me and said, "Oh, Dad, you're an old dog. It'll take you a while, but you'll learn." All right, and I do fairly well now. So that said, I want to go back, and I must say, regarding Mark's comments, I hold a very different view about what's going on Jewishly. I view it very briefly as the end of the Enlightenment period, the Haskalah period in Judaism's attempt to deal with emancipation of the Jews. Every one of the attempts, ranging from the emergence of modern Orthodoxy, which had never existed, to the historical school called Conservative Judaism in the United States, the reformist Judaism is not identified as one of the denominations as reformed. It is reform. There's no ED. Okay? All those, including Zionism, are failing. Most of them are on oxygen. Okay? And so the other things that were said, what's in Feldman's book, what Diane said, are emerging possibilities to deal with the slow death of denominational Judaism. That's why I consider myself no longer as a Jewish renewal rabbi. I grew up in the conservative movement and was educated in the conservative movement, and I'm not a conservative Jew. I am a post-denominational rabbi. I think that term works. The fastest growing denomination in Judaism, as far as organizational structures, is not identified or unaffiliated. There are more synagogues becoming unaffiliated than certainly any other single denomination or the denominations put together. And there are all sorts of demographic, financial, and theological justifications for this. There is very little identification with the theologies or philosophies or whatever. And I will say this, and this is, I know, controversial, as if I've never been. All right? If Tikkun Olam, which is cited by non-Jews as well as Jews, becomes the defining impetus for Jewish expression, goodbye Judaism. Goodbye Judaism. All right? One, it doesn't understand what the term really means. They think it means social activism of a progressive nature or of a Democratic Party nature or whatever. That is not what Tikkun Olam ever was. All right? And it has been co-opted by progressives and leftists and Democrats. All right? And that's not to say I'm not one of them, but it is not the ultimate expression of Judaism. It just isn't. All right? And I have to deal with many of the people I know and communicate with who think halacha is the defining nature of Judaism, and it isn't. All right? And then there is Reb Zalman's moving the spirituality of Hasidism into a non-Orthodox world. And yet after more than 50 years of effort, of which I was a part of, it is still not a blip on the radar screen of spiritual expression. So the question is, what? And that is one of the reasons why I have come to the conclusion that deep ecumenism, the integration of conversation, of Mary Rita's dialoguing with other spiritual traditions to find out what needs to be done to regenerate, rejuvenate, rehabilitate spiritual traditions in order to do the good that they came into this world to do. The way I view it historically, biblically, is the story of Migdal Babel, the Tower of Babel.
Mhm.
All right? Because at that point, when human beings wanted to become gods or God, and there was a confusion, what happens in the next period of Genesis is the emergence of an individual or individuals like Abraham and Sarah, and then Moses, and then the deliverance of the Torah. And then if you realize what happened is that every culture, every geographic differentiation in the world, China, Japan, Arabia, Israel, Europe, what happened in this midrashic homiletical description I'm giving you is the emergence of individuals or an individual plus a text, so that those cultures, those individuals could abide by what was in that text because it suited them culturally, geographically, etc. So that's why you have the Quran. That's why you have the Gospels. That's why you have the Eastern text. All right. The issue is that all religions became triumphalists. They became insular.
Mhm.
And as Reb Zalman describes beautifully in that teaching of deep ecumenism, they all said that in the end of times, when the Mahdi comes, when the Messiah comes, when all this happens, they will be able to say, one of them will be able to say, see, I was right. Zalman describes it beautifully. All right. And to use a good Yiddish term, it's all Narishkeit. It's all nonsense. Because to get to that point, Zalman was right. In order to get it together, we got to get together.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So how do we do that? So I want to go into this exercise because I don't want to lose the opportunity to do this. And I want to engage in the most, for me, personally, the most successful spiritual practice I have. Okay? And I learned it from Rabbi Bert Jacobson of blessed memory, Zichrono Livracha. He taught me years ago, decades ago, the spiritual practice of silence. Okay? Silence isn't the same as meditation, right? And it doesn't involve emptying, as some of the Eastern meditational practices expect of you. So we're going to sit in silence and we're going to consider the following questions. And if you have something to write on or to type on, please do, because then we'll share. Given what I said about the God field, I think I'll use the Hebrew word, I mean the English term, God field, to avoid the binyan malchut. Given the weakness, the low battery, you use your imaginal faculty and imagine that it could look like a baseball or a football field. All right. And God is struggling in that God field because the batteries are running down. Okay. Question number one. How can we, the collective we, recharge the battery? How can we collectively, however you see the collective, recharge the battery? Question two. What can Judaism do, or the Jewish people do, to participate in the recharging of the battery? And question three, maybe the most important question. What will you personally do? Because you have charging cables too. What will you do towards the recharging? Because it's getting to be Rosh Hashanah, getting to be Yom Kippur. So now let's just relax. None of that, put your feet on the floor or whatever. Just relax. To the best of your ability, just tune out things and let the thoughts about these questions overwhelm you. If you need to write them down because they're fast and furious, do so. But it's best to, if you can, stay in the silence for as long as you can. I can bring you out of the silence period, and then you can write. But if you're afraid of forgetting like me, then interrupt the silence and then go back into it. Okay, let's start. So you can move yourself from being in that state of silence and move into that wonderful experience of writing down thoughts that have come to you and being silent after writing down something to gather something else, because the creative mind works very interestingly when you engage in silence, both for a period of, let's say, 15 minutes or off and on as you're doing your work. You'll find silence is an amazing gift to us. So if you can sum it up now, you don't have to stop with just today in writing this out. By the way, while you're finishing up, one of the things, considering the age of all of us, if you'll remember, depending on if you attended a Reform or conservative synagogue when you were growing up, how many of the rabbis and cantors wore black robes and had a what is still called a pulpit talit, which is not the full big talit that has become so popular in the non-Orthodox world, whereas it used to be the exclusive control of the Orthodox. That was a change. The reason why they wore robes and the narrow thing was a result of the Enlightenment in the 19th century in Europe, which I refer to as the Protestantization of the synagogue. All right. It was very conscious. All right. It was part of the assimilationist effort. Right? The other thing I wanted to mention, Zalman says it somewhere, not in this text. He said, if you're out, I mean, he didn't on purpose mention Hasidim. But if you no, he does mention. He says, many people who came to Jewish renewal in the early days had experienced Native American traditions, rituals, ceremonies, prayers. And he said, if you want to learn how to pray with intensity, experience Native Americans. So if you've had that opportunity, you know what he was talking about. All right? There is such depth, such kavanah. All right? Now, for those who have ever gone to a Hasidic shul, and I exclude Chabad, in my experience in Chabad shuls in various places, is Orthodox davening. It is not Hasidic. The melodies are traditional Orthodox synagogue melodies. They are not Chabad melodies, and I know Chabad melodies. All right. But the first experience I ever had with multiplicity of davening experiences all at once was Simchat Torah in 1970 in Jerusalem, where on the main street, King George Street, they, like every 25 feet, was a desk or big table or whatever, and it was for different Orthodox, different Hasidic groups. So if you wanted to get a flavor of the Belzers and the Bobover and the Turakarta and the Chabad and Braslav, you could just move, which I can't move from one to the other. Their music, their tempo, their intensity levels, all different. All right. And if you want to really have a wild experience, daven with the Carliners, Rev Aaron the Great, one of the Maggid of Mezerich's disciples. They're crazy. The one time I davened with them, I felt like I should have brought some football pads because they bounce off the walls. They run back and forth in the room, and they bounce off the walls, right? In their fervency. And then you go to certain congregations I've been to where everybody's sitting in a pew. All right. And the most exercise they get is to stand up and sit down for what seems to be the reason that this is an important prayer, but they're not sure why. All right. So that was an interlude for you to change your thought patterns. Okay. Who would like to start and address any of the particular questions that they wanted? There were 3 questions, right? Who would like to start? And everybody else take note of the ideas that others have, because you didn't have all the ideas that are going to come forth. We'll start with Mike.
Okay, thank you. I kind of put all 3 together, and I suggest that for Judaism, that they suggest interfaith activities, opening up to important world events and what's going around the world, and for us and myself to attend interfaith activities. One example of that I felt was your own food justice workshop, where you had people from different faiths and actually from different countries. My minyan, which we're in a big center that has 3 different minyans, we have put on a workshop for transgender Jews. And in that minyan, we advertised it not only at Germantown Jewish Center, but also outside to the 2 other, Panay Or, Philadelphia, and Mishkan Shalom, Sean's synagogue, which is about a mile away. Before she retired from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, Rabbi Nancy Fuchs Kramer, her main emphasis was to coordinate Islamic and Jewish activities. And I attended that, and we need to do more of that. We need to be and advertise it. This is not an insular thing, as you suggested. This has to be done. And, you know, I live around the corner from the Shalom Center in Arthur Wasco, so he has activities that are interfaith, and they're always open to anyone. And of course, if you're on his mailing list, you hear about them. And let's see. And I think the key is to participate in those events. Like, I was on a social justice tour of the South and went to the Ebenezer Baptist Church on Sunday, and Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock was there. That's his church. And we went to other churches along the trip, and we were a Jewish group, and they knew who we were and welcomed us. and we invited a preacher to come give us a lecture who preached fire and brimstone in the old-fashioned way. And we all loved it and loved the fact that there was that work. I think it's out there and available to recharge our batteries, but we have to do it. We have to do it loudly and to let other people know what's going on.
Great. I like that last part. Do it loudly. Okay. No longer being hesitant. Who's next? Well, you all wrote stuff. Sippy, Yaga, Sippy, then Ruth, and who'd I see? Barbara after that.
So the first thing that came to me was watering the tree outside the fence. We're told to make a fence around the Torah to keep it safe, and I find that I can't live without diversity. I guess that's the key thing. And then I heard a phrase, the Society of the Vav, and I didn't know what it was. And I started looking it up. There's no such thing. And so I had to figure out what, what the Vav meant. And it, to me, it's all about connection. And that we don't know who the Lamed Vavniks are, but we can be Vavniks. We can do the kind and good things. So I moved to that. And then we have this word, Vayira, awe, and that has been interpreted as fear. And I think that we all have fear that keeps us from watering the tree outside the fence, from stepping outside. I have been very, very fortunate to live in Beaufort, South Carolina, and to engage with the Gullah Geechee people and their faith traditions. And I have expanded my sense of the world because of them. And then I came back to, you want the God field. And to me, that comes from writing poetry. The poetry comes from my heart. It's emotion. It connects me with me, and it takes, which is almost the last thing, which is when I first came back to Judaism, I was at Alat Chaim, and we were reading from the Torah, and the phrase "circumcise your heart and don't have such a stiff neck" came up, and it has lived with me since then, which was around 89, I think, 99. And I think that teaching is really important, because I think in order for us to love the other, we have to love ourselves. We have to notice when we have those coverings over our hearts. And the last thing is Shema. We're told to hear, and not to listen, but to hear. And to me, that's the heart. And we just have to constantly open our hearts. And I guess the first thing was yes. How can we recharge? We have to keep saying yes, like yes to this and yes to that. And I've been invited to, let me see, the Hillside. I want to make sure I say this right. Okay. The Hillside Chapel and International Truth Center. It's a Christian church in Atlanta. Every year they have an Ubuntu conference, and I have been invited to the Ubuntu conference to be the Jew, the rabbi, along with the Sikh and the Muslim and a number of other traditions to talk about how we do Ubuntu. So I guess that's it. So that's,
Great. Thank
yeah.
you.
You're
And I
welcome.
love that. Keep saying yes. All right, because there are far fewer yes mitzvot than there are do nots. That's one of our problems. All right, Ruth.
Okay, yeah, I'm glad I'm following Sippy because some of what I'm saying is very much in line with what you said, and also you gave me some ideas that I like. But for me, what came to me first about how the collective can recharge the battery is this thing of connection. That for me, what is God if not some kind of connecting force flowing through the universe? Is how I sort of experience God, and we can I think that if when we interact and emphasize connection, form connections, that does increase the God field. But then what can Judaism do in particular? I guess emphasize the texts within Judaism that emphasize those ideas about God shall be one, and prophetic things about we should all come and everyone will pray at the holy mountain or whatever, which, well, that's problematic too. But this idea of emphasizing the texts and ideas within Judaism, which are not all of the ideas in Judaism, but that really emphasize ultimate connection and ultimate oneness. And then what can I personally do? So that became harder because I've done some of that in the past, and I'm not feeling it right now so much. And in particular, some of my, more of my interreligious things that I'm involved with has been with Muslims, and some of my sort of intergroup things that I've been involved with has been with Palestinians, and even like forming individual connections with quite a few Palestinians, including people who actually live in Gaza now and or are from Gaza. And it's been like I'm not, this whole time period has been hard and I'm not feeling it. But I guess what I'm telling myself is to just sort of realize that these kinds of connections do help, the charging cables, and I can try to continue those connections even if I'm not feeling it. And then also for myself, delve more into the texts in Judaism that, that emphasize these ideas, and then just go through the world trying to see the image of God and the spirit in everyone, smile at people. Somehow that even feels like a religious act. And then I've been discouraged by some within, let's say, within the Jewish community that seem to be emphasizing the separation more. And I feel are sort of mixing the sort of ethno-political stuff with the religious stuff. But I guess I'll tell myself, try not to be discouraged with that. That's what they're doing, but I'm not like, that's not what Judaism is. So not to let that put me off too much. Those are some of my thoughts.
So first of all, the fact that you have and continue to engage with the other is most significant, and understanding there are people on both sides of the Gaza-Israel thing that have expressed, it's almost a year that this has been going on. They are fatigued. They are spiritually feel like a dish rag that's just been wrung out. It's asking a lot to maintain. And it was written about, 6 months ago, the majority of Jews in the United States politically are progressive or left. Okay, despite there is a certain amount on the right. But the natural friends for Jews over the many decades, has been the progressives, say the Democratic Party, whatever. The fact is that the left has been a huge, I'm going to use a neutral term, disappointment to the Jewish community in the United States so far. They feel abandoned. And there is a sense of abandonment going on in the Jewish world. And how these things will be repaired, if they will be repaired, is part of the deeply ecumenical work that has to be done. There is no other way to do it. And I'll just finish my rage and rant by the very famous midrash that has always affected my wife since the 70s, early 70s. And that is the midrash of King Solomon, the wise King Solomon, calls his advisors together and says, I want something, some kind of a statement that will inform everyone for every situation that comes up in life, every exigency, good or bad. And it has to be short enough of a statement to fit on a ring. And so what they come up with is Gamze Yahavor, this too shall pass. That's the second ring that I wear on my finger other than the wedding ring. And that's it for jewelry, because it's true. And so this too shall pass. And we can only do the work. All right. You know, Rabbi Tarfon was right. The work is hard and the time is short, but we don't have a right to give up on doing the work. All right. I knew there was somebody else. Barbara, I remember just in time. Go ahead, Barbara. Yeah, unmute.
In a sense, piggybacking on some of the earlier comments, in particularly in terms of engagement, and I really appreciate these questions and especially personalizing it in terms of individual action. And my dear friend, Rabbi Patricia Hickman, and I presented at the Yerusha conference earlier this year about an interfaith organization that we have been very much committed to for these last years. And it started 7 years ago. And personally, I was deeply upset about the divisiveness and the lack of civility that was going on just across the board, locally and nationally and beyond. And I spoke with the pastor of the church where I'm a member about it. And he said, well, I was just talking to a rabbi friend. And we also have a friend at the Islamic Society, and we're thinking about putting together a Thanksgiving event to bring the three faiths together. Now, this is in a very conservative small county on the east coast of Central Florida. Nothing like this had ever been done. And it was a remarkable experience that changed my life. And this has really become what I believe is my calling. We thought maybe 150 people would come. It turned out there were 400. It was standing room only. And it grew from the three faiths that we started with to now we have in the neighborhood of 25 to 30 different faith communities of all types of faith traditions. And we have wonderful leadership still from Rabbi Patricia Hickman, who has retired from a Reform synagogue, but the synagogue still remains very much a part of the organization, as well as the rabbi of a conservative congregation, as well as many other different faiths, from Buddhist to Baha'i and all forms of Christianity and others. The point is that we started with people who had shared values and open hearts to come together. And it was amazing from that small core group that it grew to our largest Thanksgiving event of 800 people showing up. And it has just been amazing. And people have said, we don't want to wait until next year for another event. So we have had other events during the course of the year, from small group dinners to our 2 weeks ago, we had a women sharing wisdom event, the first of its kind. We've had the Sacred Next Door, where we visit a church or a synagogue or a faith center that may not be familiar to many of the people. We've also just shown up kind of informally at a faith center. We have reached out racially. This is another area that we need to do a better job on in terms of our diversity. But it's a work in progress. And we've appreciated everyone who has come, who has participated in the events. It takes a tremendous amount of volunteers to put on the Thanksgiving event. We had 600 people at the reception. We had almost 100 volunteers for the whole event. But it's an opportunity for people to talk with others that they might otherwise not have an opportunity to interact with. And that's one of the key strengths. And in the process of the relationships and the oneness that we're finding in the commonalities. And personally, my job right now is reaching out to additional faith centers that are not yet already engaged. And we've had to realize that everybody doesn't want to do this. And it's I was very naive about it starting out. And this isn't for everyone. But we continue to reach out, to those who do say yes. But at least make the invitation to try to be inclusive, so that we can, in fact, increase the God field. And as we continue to pray together to a loving God of many names, and do so together.
Shoo, what a wonderful story about a wonderful place. And you probably know my deep affection for Rabbi Pat Adina. And to do this work, I mean, the last thing, what you were saying about not everybody wanting to do this, willing to do this, is the justification for doing this work. It really is. Because as Reb Zalman told us in 2003, just know that following the path of deep ecumenism, as opposed to doing the interfaith thing, all right? Not everybody goes along with it. Not everybody agrees with it. There are plenty of people who still believe that we all Jews, and in many cases, Catholics or Methodists, if you're a Lutheran, hold to the view that you are condemned to go somewhere you don't want to go when you're dead. All right. The fact is that theologically, there's still the negative teachings out there. All right. I mean, what are the biggest audience churches in the United States right now? And what are they preaching? And the reality is, it goes by certain names, but it's the gospel of wealth, the gospel of prosperity. There's a church about a mile and a half that occupies the old Walmart. They get 10,000 people. On Sunday, they hire off-duty police to control the whole area. Our favorite supermarket, you can't get there on Sunday mornings because of all the park. All right. And I've had long conversations with 4 pastors about this gospel of prosperity. And one of them, who preaches in St. Louis in her Lutheran church, says the pushback when she teaches that Jesus was poor And Jesus's concern was for the widows and orphans and the poor people. And they deny it. There are probably an equal number of Christians who deny Jesus as Jesus, as pointed out, expressed, and described in the Gospels. All right? So there's work to be done. And it's not that you can't deal with people like that, but it's hard. But the other thing, and this goes to what's already been said, is that there is a withdrawal at times on the part of people who are engaged in religious activity. They don't have time. They don't have what energy to go outside their own. And deep ecumenism is all about relationship, human relationship. Religion is secondary to the human relationship, right? As Nadia and I both say over and over again, if anti-Semitism becomes much, much worse in America, the one thing we're sure of is that the Christians that we have been in a relationship with since 2003 have our backs. And this is not a pious expectation or hope. This is reality, because every time something happens that's not good for the Jews, they express to our congregants and to Nadia and me their concern, their identity with us. And this is all because of relationship. They're good people, but they have to be made aware that outside their world exists other worlds in conflict. And right, I was amazed at our experience of going to shul on the Shabbos that the tragedy, the massacre happened at the congregation in Pittsburgh. But we were greeted, there were people doing all sorts of work on fixing light bulbs and painting and everything in the church of synagogue building. And they all came up to us and expressed their horror at what happened and their deep concern of how we felt and everything like that. It's all because of relationship. All right? And there is the opposite tendency that in times of stress, that people in religious identification withdraw into their own. It's understandable, but it has to be overcome, because, and I see the absence of this, particularly now on the college campuses, of what happened in the last quarter semester, particularly at my alma mater, the University of California at Berkeley. I was ashamed of them. I was ashamed of the leadership. I was ashamed of the students. All right. It's a high quality place, but I can say the same thing about Harvard, Cornell, Columbia, the rest of those places. All right. Do you realize this is the first time in decades that no Jewish student is from Ramaz, a graduate of the outstanding modern Orthodox yeshiva, which Daniel Siegel is a graduate of, and others. It's a great school in Manhattan. Not single one of them is feeding into Columbia University, and most of their top graduates always go to Columbia University. All right? They're scared. But the tendency on people's parts to withdraw within, and this is the time to engage outward. All right? I've heard from Jews in recent months criticism of President Biden Well, in the history of the United States presidency, not one president has ever said, except Biden, that he's a Christian Zionist. When I heard that from him, it was like unbelievable experience that I had to realize you've got a friend, right? So that's where the work is. That's where the work is. That's where we engage individually and collectively. All right. That Thanksgiving is a what? I mean, that's where we started in 2003. The first thing we did with the church was Thanksgiving. All right. And what we did, because the church had been doing for years, was going out and getting donations and going to the supermarket and getting donations for Thanksgiving food, stuffing, turkey, cranberry sauce, all that stuff. And then they would package these meals for the poor in the county. So at best, they did 70 meals, 70 bags. When we came in, which was in the summertime, we said the first thing we're doing together, we hadn't learned yet how to pray together without dilution, was we're gonna double the number of bags, because we had doubled the number of people who would show up. And we designed it with these tables with all the food items and everything, that a member of the church standing next to a member of the synagogue and on down the line. So while they're doing this scut work, packing up, they get to know each other. They talk, introduce themselves, all that stuff. We still get thanks from the church members and synagogue members who were there in the first time, because they said that was the best contrived way of getting to know somebody. All right. And one of our faithful members, who has been coming for 20 years, is a tree surgeon. And one year, when somebody from the church brought in the Christmas tree, it was really scrawny. So he's a tree surgeon. So the next year, he told the pastors, I'm bringing the Christmas tree, the Jew. And he hauls in this monstrous tree, all right? And he helps put it up. You think that's ever forgotten? All right. So it's always, it's the little things that work. All right. And it's getting involved to the extent that Nadia and I have attended funerals, weddings, baptisms of members of the church over these 20 plus years. All right. And we go every Christmas Eve. And it's so much fun singing the same Christmas hymns that we had to sing in elementary school. All right. And this past Christmas, the majority of the sermon or homily that the pastor gave was teachings from what Nadia and I had given over the year. It was like, hey, excuse me, preach your stuff. Right? It was amazing. And they're so welcoming, because we get maybe 5-6 members of our congregation that come every year on Christmas Eve. Right? And at the end, as we're all shaking hands and everything, they always ask, well, what are you people doing? We're going home for Christmas dinner. And we say, everybody says, we're going to the only Chinese restaurant, which is the only restaurant open in Boulder. So it's the levels of conversation and communication that's so important. All right. And just don't give it up, because there are very strong elements that don't appreciate this work, don't want to engage in this work, and in some cases find it antithetical their own religious expression. Right? I got an email from somebody who asked me today, this is the way it was phrased. What do we do? What do we do about the Mormons? Right? Because it has become clear that no one who has transitioned will be allowed to work with kids in Mormon communities. All right? That's an edict from Utah. All right? And my response was, because it was a person who happened to have been several years ago in the deep ecumenism class, I said, do you remember what I said when we had the project at the end of the semester that you had to engage with a person from another spiritual tradition and go deep with them on with the guidance of what Reb Zalman had taught, what I had taught? And I said, do not engage with a Mormon. With Jack Mormons, that's a different matter. All right, ones who have left the Mormon church. But if they are hard in their faith, it is extremely difficult to dialogue with them. All right. So, anybody else got some things they want to share? Yes, Mary Rita.
Well, a lot of it feels like a repeat, but I want to say that I was thinking that there was a lot of work done in Oseh Shalom, my brick and mortar community. And I think a lot of the reaching out, because we have a lot of different Christian churches in the Laurel, Maryland area. There is an Islamic center around the corner. And it was 9/11 that started the reaching out. And I still remember that the people from the Islamic Center coming over when we were having a service after 9/11. And that was the beginning of our relationships. And the relationships involved our being invited to their place, their center, not just for services, but for other celebrations that included sharing meals. And they came over and would share meals with us and then come into services. And I remember one of the women saying to me, a lot of these prayers sound really familiar. Like we have some prayers like this. And it was like praying together, getting to know each other, and that meant a lot. And then we also had Thanksgiving, and every year a different house of, a different faith community would host Thanksgiving. And COVID erased a lot of what we were doing and continuing. So as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking one of the things, and in some ways what took over was doing social justice, and that became a lot of energy that our community focused on. But I'm sitting here thinking, why can't we do some of the social justice, because it's focused on Montgomery County? Why can't we do it with other faith communities? And there we get to know them. And we also get a chance at times to then invite them to our services. So I love that. And Barbara, I loved hearing all the, she's not here now, but I loved all that she shared about how they did Thanksgiving. And then I was thinking about the midrash that's in Reb Zalman's the Deep Ecumenism. And it's where Aaron, is walking through the community, and the two men that really didn't like each other. And what he did, he went to one and said, I noticed, but when you go past that person, like, just be nice with that person. And he said it to the other. And at one point they did. And from what I remember, what happened then was the creation of their connection was the cloud of glory that came. And that's when Zalman talked about how it really needed charging. And I thought, there's a lot I can do individually by just, getting to know the people in my neighborhood. I keep on thinking of what the Democrats were saying about what you could do now, which is really to go and get to know the people in your neighborhood and start talking to them. And I think that's really important. We live between two modern Orthodox families, and Dan asked Nahum if he could go to services with them one Friday night, because he's really, really curious about what an Orthodox service is like. And Nahum said, "You can come too." And I thought, do I really want to go and have a mechitza, between us? But I thought it would mean a lot. And we have shared Sukkot with them, and I've learned so much from them. So it's not always just Christian groups, but we're not Orthodox. We're not modern Orthodox. And it has really helped us to understand our neighbors. And we live in a very Orthodox neighborhood. And I think that also creates a God field, that I'm not. Yeah, I know.
Let's hold it. No, I just wanted to say, let's not pass over that part too quickly.
Right.
All right.
Yeah.
I have my issues, but when you pull it off, all right. I mean, yeah.
We share a sukkah because they know that we have not put one up, and they have said every year, if we're not there, just go in. And I always, if we're gonna go in, I'll let either Nahum or Hadass know. But it's like, what's ours is yours, and we have the same faith, so come and join us.
Yeah. I mean, I've mentioned in the past that when I used to teach this course, usually the second or third session, one of the rabbinical students would say, why is this, deep human, why aren't we talking about getting along with our fellow Jews? And you've heard my lines before, Mary Reed. And it boils down to, if it gets into the deep discussion, I say, hey, I'll meet you 5 cubits if you can meet me 1 cubit. And they'll refuse to meet me 1 cubit. They can't. I know they can't. I've done this for 40, 50 years. All right. So that's one of the problems. But on the other hand, when I left the conservative movement and we had this independent congregation in Los Angeles, at a certain point, I really wanted to hang out with some rabbis. All right. I was no longer appreciated in the conservative movement because Nadia and I did this gay wedding before it was acceptable. All right. So I decided that the best thing to do is to find an Orthodox rabbi. And I found a Sephardic Turkish rabbi in Los Angeles who we became friends, close friends. And he was a moil, so he did the circumcisions in our congregation. But he said early on, he said, I don't agree with all the things that you think and do, but at least you know your stuff. All right. So on a common basis of knowledge, I was able to do that. So if you can, and here in Boulder, there still are, from the defunct Orthodox congregation, a number of Orthodox Jews that we're very close with, including the Rebbitzin of the Chabad rabbi. Whenever she sees us, 45 minutes of conversation for sure. So it's not impossible, but in certain, and when I finally got to serve on the first board of rabbis that would accept us, there were Orthodox rabbis who gravitated more towards us because they appreciated that our foundation was based in Hasidic stuff. So the last thing I want to mention, which is part and parcel of what Mark was bringing up about the different elements that exist in Judaism. When Reb Zalman came to the United States in the 40s and enrolled in the Chabad yeshiva, this was a period of time that lasted to this day of what Reb Zalman identified as restorationist Judaism. They were well aware at the Chabad Yeshiva, 770 Eastern Parkway, they were well aware that much of the traditional Jewish culture, society, population, institutions, and scholarship and religious leadership had been murdered during the Holocaust. And so the purpose of the yeshiva and the purpose of educating these future rabbis of Chabad and in Orthodoxy and in the conservative movement, all this during and post-war was restorationist Judaism, to restore the population that was lost and to restore Judaism as of days of old. Kadesh Yameinu Kekedem, renew us as of in the past. And Zalman bought it for a period of time. But then he realized it was absolutely wrong approach. And he realized this as a result of once he was ordained as a Chabad rabbi, and his good buddy from Europe, who was already ordained from a Lithuanian yeshiva, but came over to Chabad, Rabbi Shlomo Karlibach, were the first emissaries. And the Rebbe told them, go out there to the colleges and bring the Jews back to restore them to our ancient traditions. And what they realized with meeting with the college students, that was not what the students were interested in. All right? And slowly but surely, what Zalman came to realize over time was restorative Judaism was the wrong approach. It would not work in the United States. Maybe among a small Orthodox world, but not with the mass Jewish population. And that's where he began to develop the notion, and the name eventually emerged as renewal. All right? And Jewish renewal, I don't use the term very often anymore. I use the term renewal of Judaism because that opens up all sorts of possibilities. And the other thing to understand as we transition to whatever is this beautiful midrash where Moses is sitting with God, and they look down and they see this gathering of people, one of whom is Rabbi Akiva, another is Rabbi Tarfon, another is Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, and a few others. And they're talking. And Moses doesn't understand a word they're talking about. And Moses turns to God and says, what are they talking about? And God says, Torah min Moshe, the Torah from Moses.
Mm.
And Moses is blown away. And then he asks a very odd question. He says to God, show me their future. And he shows what happened to each of those rabbis, all of whom were killed in the most torturous fashion by the Romans. All right. And he asks, is this our fate? Well, the question is not the part that's typical oy vey, how we have suffered part of the story. The point for me in that midrash is that the Torah being taught by Rabbi Akiva and other rabbis had no resemblance to the Torah of Moses. The verses cited might have been the same, but the discussion about its meaning, its implication, its application was totally different. And the Judaism that emerged in the Talmudic times, that's still with us, the 1,000 years it took to construct a Talmudic society, followed by the rabbinic model, paradigm, which was an extension and continuation of that model, has very little to do, if anything, with the Torah of Moses. The Judaism of the future will have little resemblance. And it is the restorative model that keeps us from moving forward. The fear that you find in the Jewish world of coming up with something else that doesn't look like Judaism. It was also Zalman's fear also. That's why Zalman kept preaching backward compatibility. He would say, as you're racing down the road to renew Judaism, to be creative, don't forget to look in the rear view mirror. And I used to say to him, every time he said it in my presence, I'd say, I'd shake my finger, look like he'd shaking at me. And I'd say, you know, you look too long in the rear view mirror, you're bound to crash. And he'd smile at me and nod. He understood where I was coming from. My job was to create, still is, a Jewish expression for our times in the future. And Reb Zalman had no idea. He couldn't enunciate how to decide what was good to bring from the old paradigm into the new paradigm. He was asked many times, what's the criteria? How do you evaluate? Right? And I'd say to him privately, the prophetic tradition has to be brought forward. All right? In addition to that, there is the ethical material, the moral ethical material that's found in our texts. Because in many cases, it's ahead of even today's jurisprudence in America and England, Western democracies. But not all of it. The misogynistic material, forget it. The fact that anything that it was adjudicated by men about women, like their menstrual cycles, forget it. All right? And all seminaries should forget about teaching it. Because I had to learn it. All right, so I want to stop at this point. Thank you very much. I'm going to keep engaging you because now the work becomes yours. And I really enjoyed what you guys had to offer. And keep thinking about it. Don't let it finish, because what are you going to do when Christmas comes up? What are you going to do when Ramadan comes around? What are you going to do as an individual? How are you going to engage? All right? None of these, what are you going to do when Yom Kippur? I love it when I see all the Christians from our church and the pastors sitting in the pews on Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah. All right? because they're getting it. And they say the similarities and the differences, but at this stage, they can talk about that. All right. So see you next week. Enjoy Shabbat. As Nadia's sweatshirt says, Shabbat. Just do it. All right.
Victor,
Rabbi.
Victor, are you going
Yes.
to talk about Teshuvah and how other faiths deal with that issue?
Oh, you really want that, huh?
Yeah,
Okay. Therein lies differences as well as commonality. It's a great thing. Yes. I always like to do that because it's one of those things that when you are fulfilled with the commonalities, then you can handle the differences and the whole issue of atonement and tshuva and all that. At least in Christianity and in Judaism, it weighs very big and it should be looked at. So yes, thank you for reminding me to say something about it. Yeah. Okay. See you
Okay,
next
thank
week.
you, Bye-bye.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.